I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Plasma gelsolin is an abundant endogenous regulator of inflammation that's consumed during severe inflammatory insults. When levels fall too low, patients are at a higher risk of organ damage and death, particularly in settings like acute respiratory distress syndrome, where a dysregulated inflammatory response floods the lungs with fluid and leaves patients dependent on ventilatory support with no approved therapies today. BioAegis Therapeutics is working to turn recombinant human plasma gelsolin into a pipeline and a product. Susan Levinson, CEO of BioAegis, discusses recombinant human plasma gelsolin as a potential first-in-class treatment for ARDS and other inflammasome-driven conditions, how it modulates cytokine storms without suppressing the immune system, and its potential in other conditions, including neurodegenerative diseases. Susan, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
We're going to talk about acute respiratory distress syndrome, BioAegis, and its recombinant human plasma gelsolin as a pipeline and a product. Plasma gelsolin is present in the blood. What is it, and how does it normally function in the body?
Plasma gelsolin is a normal human protein, and it functions at the core of our immune system as a major regulator of inflammation. It is designed to permit inflammation where it is needed to counter the threats that attack us, such as infection and injury, but to also then quench the fire when it is time to shift from the inflammatory situation into a healing mode. But there's a catch to it. Protein is consumed by the inflammatory process. And if the levels fall too low, the person is at risk of severe morbidity or mortality.
And in the case of inflammatory disease, is it a cause or an effect? Does it deplete because of the disease, or does it have any role in actually causing it?
So it's inflammation that's actually the cause that gelsolin is addressing. So many diseases are addressed by the body by generating inflammation to counter them. And so it's a tool that our bodies use to address those threats. And so the inflammation is important to protect us from the threats. But what happens is excess inflammation can happen as a result of trying to address those threats. And that's at the core of most of the diseases that result in human suffering and mortality. And so gelsolin's role in the body is to regulate that important tool so that it doesn't get out of control. So it's neither the absence of gelsolin is not the cause of the disease, it's the solution to the disease.
Your experimental therapy grew out of work that was done at Harvard and that you then licensed. What exactly was that work, and what did BioAegis license?
So Dr. Thomas Stossel was a hematologist at Harvard Medical School, American Cancer Society professor of medicine. He actually discovered the protein gelsolin, and he led research on its role while he was at Brigham and Women's Hospital. So we actually co-founded the BioAegis company with Tom, who unfortunately passed away several years ago. We licensed all the rights to all the technology and know-how associated with the protein that Tom and others worked on, all of which were put together by Harvard in the license to us, and that included over 40 patents at the time. We've filed additional new IP based on our research since licensing the technology from Harvard.
The company's lead indication is acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. This is something that people may have become more aware of during the COVID-19 pandemic, but for listeners who are not familiar with it, what is it?
So, acute respiratory distress syndrome, also known as ARDS, is a life threatening lung injury. It allows fluid to leak into the lungs. Breathing becomes difficult, and oxygen cannot get into the body. It may occur due to an infection, for example, COVID, where it was seen quite a bit, or to trauma. So it's not just about infection, it's also about there are other causes of ARDS. In the case of infection, it may be diagnosed as sepsis, which many people have heard of. And sepsis results in organ damage to the lung, but also to other organs. The most severe type of ARDS leads to death in 40% of the patients. So it's a pretty serious condition.
And what treatment options exist today?
Today, there are actually no approved pharmaceutical treatments for ARDS, which is really unfortunate. Treatment today is focused on supportive care to get more oxygen into the blood. For example, patients receive supplementary oxygen and they may be placed on a mechanical ventilator, as we often saw during the COVID pandemic. But there's been very little additional research on ARDS to identify new pharmacological agents to treat it.
There's been decades of research around ARDS. Why haven't we seen therapies come to market yet?
ARDS is a very complex disease, and it has many causes, as I mentioned earlier, including infection and various types of trauma, injury, and burns. That the variability across patients makes it very difficult to conduct clinical studies. And this has discouraged companies from even trying. There's been considerable research about the treatments that are out there, the supportive treatments, and how to better manage the patients, including a lot of learnings that were gained within the COVID pandemic. But in terms of looking for pharmaceutical agents, it's been very difficult to study the condition to be able to get a pharmaceutical approved. So solving this clinical problem can be kind of thought of as a moonshot. In other words, a very challenging problem, but with an enormous benefit when successful.
And is the problem that the immune system is just overwhelming the lungs? Is this what's known as a cytokine storm?
Yes, that's a good way of describing it. It's really the inflammatory system. It's not the immune system out of control. In fact, in many of these patients, the immune system is severely depressed. And that's one of the benefits of gelsolin, that many of the agents that are out there to slow down the inflammation and treat the patient are also immunosuppressive. On the other hand, gelsolin is quite unique in that we've actually demonstrated that if you give gelsolin in animal models to animals that have been infected with extremely serious infections, it actually improves survival. So it has the unique role of being anti-inflammatory, but also not immunosuppressive. That's a huge advantage. And I think it will lead to a much safer profile for these very seriously ill patients.
How well understood is what it's actually doing when you treat a patient with this?
Let me tell you a little bit about how it works. It's a highly abundant protein that's circulating in the blood of healthy individuals. And as I mentioned before, it has an impressive safety profile. That has been demonstrated in a range of animal studies as well as in humans. In fact, we have treated healthy individuals, in other words, people who already have normal levels of gelsolin in their blood. And we've given them doses of gelsolin which raise their gelsolin levels tenfold above their baseline level with no concerning safety findings. So that's one important thing about how it works, that it's a really safe protein that's already in our blood. We just need to replenish it when it's missing. The normal physiological function of the protein addresses the complexity of the inflammatory process. It's a regulator, and it interrupts the activity of something called the NLRP3 inflammasome. This is a system in cells that's actually been associated with the inflammation that increases with aging. Really interesting. But in addition to that, gelsolin also counteracts a range of other inflammatory agents that are produced in the response to threats. And those are the agents that are usually referred to as the cytokine storm. So there's data demonstrating that gelsolin directly blocks that cytokine storm. We've shown that in animals. And we just have to show all this in human studies, which we're working on.
Well, what's known about it from the studies you've done to date, either preclinically or clinically, in terms of its safety or efficacy?
So it works specifically on the two key cell types that are responsible for the inflammatory response. That is the macrophage and the neutrophil. And it precisely controls their responses when the body receives a threat. So it's able to manage the immune response without suppressing the body's ability to fight off infection. We've demonstrated this in dozens of animal models in a wide range of diseases. So while our primary indication that we're pursuing right now is acute respiratory distress syndrome, we've actually demonstrated in more than 24 animal models of different diseases, whether it's infection, injury, trauma, metabolic disease, and neurologic disease, that it's effective. The commonality of all those diseases is the presence of inflammation.
You've talked about the relationship between aging and lower levels of this. How broadly are you looking at this as a potential treatment? And as you think about many of the neurodegenerative diseases that are associated with aging, inflammation is a primary characteristic of them. Is there a possibility to treat some of those with this approach?
So it's interesting that you mention that the levels drop with aging. That's actually not necessarily the case. The um, So just because you're older doesn't mean your gelsolin levels are lower. It really depends on your health condition. So if you have a lot of inflammation in your body because of diseases you've accumulated, your levels are going to be lower and you need restoration. But the interesting thing is, gelsolin is made by all the cells in your body. And if you have a lot of muscle in your body, you generate a lot of gelsolin. So one of the things we often say to people is keep exercising, keep moving, because you want to keep your gelsolin levels high to protect you from all those conditions of aging.
Are there particular endpoints or biomarkers you're using in the clinical studies that you consider particularly meaningful?
In our clinical studies in ARDS in particular, there are two primary endpoints that we need to follow in order to get regulatory approval. Most important is safety, of course, and mortality. In order to get approval for a drug in this indication, we have to show an improvement in mortality. We also are looking at other endpoints in our studies, including how long a patient stays in the hospital, how long they are on a ventilator, how quickly they can get off the ventilator, how long they're in the intensive care unit, because all of these are important to assuring not just that the patient survives, but they survive well and that we can reduce healthcare costs by getting them out of the hospital, back home, and feeling better.
ARDS trials can be notoriously complex in recruitment and data collection. What lessons have you learned from running studies in an acute care setting?
Yes, indeed, it is very difficult to run an ARDS study. And I would say that the primary things that we've learned in our study, we have a large number of investigator sites because we have a very tightly defined patient population in order to ensure that we can get good data out of this study. And the important thing is to carefully monitor and work with those sites. We have over 70 clinical sites around the world. We work very closely with them. We build relationships with those investigators. We check in very often with them to make sure that they have everything they need because hospitals are often stressed with resources, especially in these very serious units like an intensive care unit. We have to make sure they have the resources to find the patients and treat the patients and follow all the rules in the protocol. The protocol is rather complex. Most clinical trial protocols are. And as long as we need to keep the study very tightly controlled in order to get the best data out of the results.
And if you're successful with this, how do you think it might reshape care of ARDS or related inflammatory conditions?
I think gelsolin has the potential to totally transform the way inflammatory disease is treated. It is so safe and non immunosuppressive, and that's unique in this marketplace. Most, if not all, of the therapeutic anti inflammatory agents that are on the market work by suppressing the immune system in order to bring the inflammation down. Gelsolin is different. It doesn't suppress the immune system. It only suppresses the inflammatory aspects of the immune system. As I mentioned earlier, we have shown that it's actually effective in treating the most severe infections that we've given in animal studies. And there's no evidence that it will be immunosuppressive in patients either. So we look forward to having a new way to treat inflammation for patients.
You've got a partnership with the U.S. Navy Office of Naval Research for inflammasome-driven decompression sickness studies. How does that collaboration connect with your broader clinical strategy?
So that is a fascinating opportunity that evolved from preclinical research, which demonstrated that the bends or decompression sickness and the associated bubbles that we've all heard of that are commonly understood to be associated with decompression sickness are actually the result of an inflammatory insult that's driven by the compression and decompression processes. So the finding that recombinant gelsolin was able to block this inflammatory process in animals has led to the Navy's keen interest in what they call decompression in a syringe. The mechanism of action in this disease, as with others, is just to get the inflammation under control through the same NLRP3 inflammasome. So this is another way for us to demonstrate gelsolin's efficacy. And the Navy is helping us with this study, funding the work that we're doing through the University of Maryland to do our next clinical study.
It does seem that you're taking a pipeline and a product strategy here. How broadly applicable might this be across other inflammatory diseases?
Gelsolin could be applied to any inflammatory disease. Of course, we're going to focus on the ones that are the most serious and have the biggest gap in current treatment. I think we don't know all of the places where it could be applicable. We have a handful in mind that we're going to pursue next, but the key next step for us, once we demonstrate human proof of concept in either ARDS or decompression sickness, is to move into chronic illness. That's where there's an enormous opportunity, even in diseases which already have multiple therapeutics available for them. None of those products absolutely treat everyone in those diseases. There always are gaps in treatments and opportunities for additional treatment. And with the safety profile that we have and the non-immunosuppressive nature of gelsolin, we believe there's a whole range of new indications that we can pursue.
And given how this works, would you expect to use it as a monotherapy or in combination with others?
So we are only studying this as monotherapy. It's you really need to get one product approved before you can combine it with another product. But of course, in the clinical setting, doctors often use multiple therapeutics to treat a condition. And in our studies, we do not restrict treatment with other products in our clinical trials as long as they're already approved products. So in the future, whatever products are available, they may be used in combination in, in the hospital or in whatever healthcare setting doctors are treating their patients.
And how far will existing cash take you, and how are you thinking about fundraising activities going forward?
So we have been very fortunate to obtain considerable non-dilutive funding, interestingly, including $20 million from BARDA, which is supporting our ARDS study. We're actually right now raising funding, additional funding right now to support that and to move into chronic diseases when we're ready. But we also continue to look for non-dilutive opportunities.
As you talk to investors these days, have you found any change in the nature of those conversations, or are they more aggressive than they were in the past several years?
Well, as you probably know, last year was a very difficult funding environment for biotech. We're hoping that 2026 will be more successful on that front, not just for us, but for all the young companies that are making a difference in our health and our lives. The signs are looking much better. So let's hope that this continues. And we are definitely going to raise funds this year. And the more funds we raise, the more indications we can pursue. So we are excited about the future.
Susan Levinson, CEO of BioAegis Therapeutics. Susan, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Dan. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.